Imagine living in a world where every glance carries weight, where silence is not absence but presence, and where family ties feel more like chains than bonds. This is the world of Betty Whittaker, a woman who has endured decades of whispers, rumors, and truths too heavy for most to even comprehend. But unlike the generations before her, Betty has found herself standing at a breaking point. Because now, the shadow of BJ, the name that lingers like poison in every conversation, has returned, threatening to unravel what little stability remains. For outsiders, the Whittaker family has always been a subject of fascination. Whispers of their isolation, their struggles, their strangeness, and their uncanny existence echo through every article, documentary, and rumor. But for Betty, there is no fascination-only survival. She has lived inside the very walls people speculate about. She has seen what outsiders could never capture. And at the center of those secrets, like a storm refusing to pass, lies BJ. BJ is not just another relative. BJ is not simply a name that stirs gossip. To Betty, BJ is the embodiment of everything that threatens the fragile balance of the family. The fights, the shame, the fear of exposure, it all seems to return to her. Every time BJ's presence slips back into their lives, the foundation shakes. Betty has watched it happen before. Children crying, siblings torn apart, men driven by impulses they can't control. And now she feels it happening again. Late at night, Betty listens to the hum of the house. She hears Larry's phone buzzing in the darkness, his voice lowered to a whisper as he speaks into the receiver. She doesn't need to ask who's on the other end. She already knows. The sound of BJ's name is etched into her bones. It's a sound that makes her stomach tighten and her chest ache with dread. She knows that every secret call is another crack in the structure of their family. Betty was never given the luxury of choice. Born into silence, raised in cycles she didn't create, she has lived her life carrying the burden of survival. But BJ thrives in chaos. She arrives like a spark, igniting everything she touches, and when the flames spread, it is Betty who is left to smother the fire. Betty knows this pattern too well, and she knows that each time it returns, the damage deepens. The Whittaker family's history has always been one of survival in isolation. For decades, their lives unfolded in the shadows of the Appalachian Hills, away from the watchful eyes of outsiders. Their struggles were not just whispered, they were inherited. Generations grew up in the same house, the same silence, the same patterns of secrecy. And with each cycle, the price became heavier: physical struggles, mental scars, the weight of choices that could no longer be undone. Betty saw it all. She grew up watching siblings falter under burdens they didn't ask for, watching cousins live lives that felt less like choices and more like inevitabilities. But unlike so many others, Betty carried awareness. She recognized the patterns. She saw the danger of silence. And when BJ began to weave her way deeper into the family, Betty understood something others didn't. BJ was not just another figure in the cycle, she was the fracture that could split everything apart. To the outside world, BJ might seem like just another troubled name in a troubled family. But to Betty, she is the embodiment of betrayal. The one who lashes out, who tears open old wounds, who invites outsiders to gawk and whisper. The one who refuses to let the family heal because pain in BJ's hands becomes a weapon. And Larry, Betty's closest ally, her brother, her lifeline, has become ensnared. His phone calls, his secret meetings, his reluctance to let go of BJ's influence all feel like knives pressed into Betty's back. She wonders if he even realizes what's at stake. Does he understand that his loyalty to BJ could mean the destruction of everything Betty has tried so hard to protect? Or is he too blinded by some twisted sense of connection to see the collapse forming around them? Betty's days are filled with small acts of survival. Cooking meals with trembling hands. Checking the locks on the doors twice before nightfall. Watching the younger ones, making sure their laughter is not disrupted by the heaviness that looms over the family. But at night, when the walls grow quiet, she can feel the storm brewing. She knows BJ is calling. She knows Larry is listening. And she knows that the silence, the same silence that has held this family together for generations, is about to break. The story of Betty Whittaker is not one of choice. It is one of inevitability. She was born into a family that has carried its own history like a curse. But unlike those who came before her, Betty sees the cracks forming. She knows the collapse is near. And she knows that if BJ is allowed to remain a part of their lives, the collapse won't just be a possibility, it will be certain. The question that lingers heavy and unspoken is simple. How much can one woman carry before she breaks? Betty has endured shame, ridicule, secrets, and silence. She has lived as the matriarch, the shield, the quiet protector. But even shields can splinter. And when they do, everything they guarded comes crashing down. The world will remember Betty Whittaker as a name tied to one of America's most infamous families. But behind the name is a woman staring into the face of collapse, holding secrets too heavy to carry and fighting to protect what little remains. And in that fight, the truth about BJ, about the family itself, will be forced into the light. Because secrets don't stay buried forever, and Betty knows it better than anyone. The silence in the Whittaker home was never simple quiet. It was layered, weighted, alive. Each creak of the floorboards, each slam of the screen door, each whisper behind closed lips carried meaning. Betty had grown used to reading silence the way others read books, but in recent weeks that silence had shifted. It was no longer protective, it was suspicious. And at the heart of it, she knew, was BJ. The first sign came with Larry. His late-night pacing wasn't new, but it had grown more frantic. He walked the hall as though trying to outrun thoughts that refused to rest. The glow of his phone was his only companion, and though he tried to shield it from Betty's eyes, she could see enough. A name would flash briefly before he turned the screen away. A name she already knew too well, BJ. Betty told herself not to confront him in anger. She had lived long enough to know shouting only drove secrets deeper underground. But each night, as Larry pressed the phone to his ear and whispered into the dark, she felt the walls tightening around her. She remembered the last time BJ had returned, how quickly the family's fragile peace had cracked. She remembered Timmy's tears, the bruises no one wanted to explain, the way Lorraine's voice shook when she tried to talk about what she'd seen. She remembered the endless questions from outsiders, their curiosity wrapped in cruelty. And she remembered the shame, the kind that doesn't fade, the kind that seeps into your bones and settles there like rot. Betty had survived that once. She wasn't sure she could survive it again, but survival wasn't a choice. It never had been. In the Whittaker family, survival was the only language anyone truly spoke, and so Betty began to watch more closely. She listened not only to Larry's whispers but to the footsteps in the yard, the knocks at the door, the shifting tones of neighbors who seemed suddenly too interested in their business. Something was stirring. Something she could feel in her chest, like a weight pressing harder each day. BJ's return wasn't just a possibility, it was inevitable. Outsiders would never understand the gravity of her presence. They saw a woman with a past, someone troubled, someone caught in the endless cycles of poverty and isolation. But for Betty, BJ represented something far more dangerous: exposure. Every time BJ appeared, she dragged the family's darkest truths into the light. She laughed at the pain, turned it into spectacle, invited outsiders to point and gawk. For a family that had survived for generations by hiding in plain sight, BJ was a walking catastrophe. And yet Larry couldn't seem to let go. Betty wondered what hold BJ had over him. Was it love twisted into something unrecognizable? Was it guilt, shame, or some desperate attempt at redemption? Or was it simply that Larry, like so many before him, was unable to break free of the cycles that bound them all? Whatever it was, Betty knew it would cost them dearly. She began to notice changes in the others too. Lorraine's voice was sharper, as though she sensed the coming storm but couldn't find words to name it. Timmy was restless, eyes darting whenever BJ's name was even hinted at. He remembered too much. He carried scars that Betty tried to soothe but could never erase. And the younger ones, though too small to fully understand, absorbed the tension like sponges. Their laughter grew shorter, their games more frantic, as if even they knew something was about to break. Betty tried to hold the center. She cooked meals, cleaned rooms, mended clothes. She tried to keep the routines alive, to remind everyone that life could still move forward even when shadows loomed. But each act felt heavier, as though she were trying to carry water in a basket. Every stitch came undone the moment BJ's name was whispered again. And whispered it was. In the community, in hushed conversations Betty couldn't quite hear but knew were about her family. The Whittaker name had always drawn curiosity, but now the whispers were louder. Outsiders had caught scent of something, and Betty feared it was only a matter of time before someone came knocking. Cameras, questions, judgments, they had been through it before, and she knew what it did to the family. It wasn't just humiliation, it was destruction. Outsiders didn't just watch. They tore open wounds and left them bleeding. Betty's nights became restless vigils. She would sit by the small kitchen window, watching the yard for signs of movement. More than once she thought she saw a shadow lingering near the camper down the hill. Larry denied it, swore he wasn't hiding anything. But Betty had lived too long with lies to mistake them for truth. She knew BJ was closer than anyone admitted. The past had a way of circling back. Betty remembered the day BJ first turned the family upside down, how quickly tempers flared, how swiftly peace dissolved. She remembered Larry defending her, insisting she needed help, insisting they couldn't just turn her away. Betty had wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that compassion could win over chaos. But what followed was nothing but scars, scars that still marked them all. Now, watching Larry's restless pacing, hearing the muffled tones of his late-night conversations, Betty felt those scars burning fresh again. She knew collapse when she saw it. Collapse never came suddenly, it crept in slowly, like water seeping through cracks in the floorboards until one day the foundation gave way and the house came crashing down. Betty couldn't let that happen. The family had endured too much already. They had been laughed at, pointed at, judged by people who knew nothing of their lives. They had carried the burden of history, the weight of choices made long before they were born. Betty had spent her life shielding them as best she could. But if BJ was allowed back in, there would be no shield strong enough to withstand the storm. She thought about confronting Larry outright, demanding the truth. But part of her hesitated. She knew that if she pushed too hard, he would retreat further into secrecy. He would defend BJ, protect her, maybe even choose her over the family. And that was a risk Betty couldn't take not yet. She needed to be sure. She needed proof. So she waited, and in the waiting, the weight grew heavier. Days turned into weeks, each one marked by a growing sense of dread. The children whispered among themselves, asking questions Betty couldn't answer. Neighbors looked at her with knowing eyes, their silence louder than words. And Larry grew more distant, his conversations shorter, his eyes darker. Until finally, one morning, Betty's fears were confirmed. She saw Larry sitting outside the camper at the edge of the property, his head bowed, his posture heavy with guilt. The door was closed, but Betty felt the truth in her bones. BJ was inside. Her hands trembled as she watched, anger and sorrow colliding in her chest. This was the betrayal she had dreaded, the collapse she had tried to prevent. Larry had chosen BJ, chosen secrecy, chosen to risk everything they had left. Betty wanted to scream, to drag him from the camper and demand he face the truth. But she didn't. Instead, she turned away, her heart pounding with the weight of realization. Confrontation would come, but not now, not yet. She needed to be ready. She needed to know exactly what secrets BJ carried this time, because secrets were never just words. In their family, secrets were weapons. And BJ had always known how to use them. The days that followed felt like walking on broken glass. Every conversation was fragile, every glance loaded with meaning. Betty felt the eyes of the family on her, waiting to see what she would do. But she held her silence, waiting for the right moment. Because the truth was clear, BJ's return was not just about Larry's weakness. It was about the survival of the entire family. If she was allowed to stay, to spread her chaos, to reveal the truths Betty had worked so hard to bury, then everything, the home, the fragile unity, the last threads of dignity would collapse, and Betty Whittaker would not let that happen. The collapse was coming. She could feel it in her bones, hear it in the whispers, see it in the restless movements of those around her. But she also knew something else. When the collapse came, it would not come quietly. The secrets BJ carried were about to be dragged into the light. And when they were, no one in the Whittaker family would be left untouched. Secrets in the Whittaker family were never quiet things. They didn't stay locked away, hidden in diaries or whispered once and forgotten. Secrets had weight. They pressed down on the walls of the house, soaked into the floors, clung to the fabric of clothes until they could no longer be ignored. And when they broke free, they tore through the family like storms across the mountains. Betty had always feared this moment. She had seen it coming, felt it in the way Larry avoided her eyes, in the restless pacing that kept her awake at night, in the hushed conversations that died when she entered the room. But no amount of fear could prepare her for the reality. Because BJ's secrets weren't just dangerous, they were corrosive. And once they surfaced, they would eat through the fragile balance the family had built, leaving nothing but ruin behind. It began with whispers. Not from outsiders this time, but from within. Timmy was the first. His voice cracked with the weight of things a boy should never have to carry. Late one evening, he approached Betty while the others were outside, his hands shaking as he held on to her sleeve. His words came haltingly, but their meaning was clear. He had seen her with Larry, seen the way she laughed in his ear, the way she promised things that made no sense, the way she spoke of plans that would take him away from the family. Betty's heart clenched. She had known Larry was in contact, but to hear that BJ was plotting, weaving schemes that involved tearing him from the house, it was a wound that cut deeper than she expected. Timmy's fear was real, his eyes wide with the terror of losing what little stability he had left. Betty held him close, whispered reassurances she wasn't sure she believed. But Timmy wasn't the only one. Larini had her own story. She had passed by the camper one morning and heard voices inside. Voices that weren't just Larry's and BJ's, strangers, outsiders, people who had no business being on their land. She hadn't stayed long, fear had pushed her back, but what she heard chilled her. Words about money, about selling things that didn't belong to them, about fixing problems once and for all. For a family that had survived generations by keeping to themselves, by avoiding outsiders at all costs, the idea that BJ was bringing strangers into their world was almost unthinkable. Betty felt the floor beneath her shifting. This wasn't just about family loyalty anymore. This was about betrayal on a scale she hadn't imagined. Days later, the truth grew darker still. Betty overheard Larry himself, his voice low but urgent as he spoke to BJ outside. She couldn't hear every word, but the pieces she caught were enough. They don't have to know. We'll take what's ours. Nobody can stop us. His tone was not just desperate, it was dangerous. The weight of it sank into Betty's chest. This wasn't just about phone calls, about whispers in the night. BJ was pulling Larry into something larger, something that threatened not just the family's fragile peace, but their very survival. Betty remembered the stories she had heard growing up, stories of choices made in the shadows, of deals that destroyed lives, of whispers that turned to curses. She remembered the warnings her mother gave her, that once you let outsiders into your secrets, you lose control of them forever. And now it was happening again, right in front of her eyes. BJ had returned, and with her came more than chaos. She brought danger. The confrontation came sooner than Betty expected. One evening, as the sun sank behind the trees, she found Larry outside the camper, his shoulders tense, his eyes bloodshot. She called his name, her voice steadier than she felt. He turned, startled, his face hardening as though he had been caught with blood on his hands. "You think I don't know?" Betty's voice cut through the still air. "You think I can't hear the whispers? You think I don't see what you're doing?" Larry tried to deflect, to brush her off with a shake of his head, but Betty pressed on. "You're bringing her back into this family. You're letting her poison every last one of us, and now you're bringing strangers? Outsiders? What are you thinking, Larry?" His silence was answer enough. Behind the closed door of the camper, Betty thought she heard movement. A shadow flickered against the thin curtain. She knew BJ was listening. She knew BJ was smiling, satisfied that her presence had once again driven a wedge into the family. Larry's voice finally broke the silence, low and hoarse. "You don't understand. She knows things. She's got answers." "Answers?" Betty snapped. "Answers to what? To tearing us apart? To dragging us through the mud again? To selling off whatever little dignity we have left?" Larry's jaw clenched, his eyes darting toward the camper. "She said she can help us. She said, help us." Betty cut him off, her voice rising. Since when has BJ ever helped anyone but herself? Every time she shows her face, it ends in pain. Every time, Larry, and you keep falling for it. The words hung in the air like a blade. Larry looked away, his silence an admission of guilt. Betty felt the weight of decades pressing down on her. The cycle was repeating. History was swallowing them whole, and she was powerless to stop it. But BJ's secrets weren't finished revealing themselves. The following morning, word spread through the community. Someone had seen BJ in town. Not just passing through, but speaking openly, boasting even. Whispers reached Betty's ears. BJ had been telling outsiders stories about the family, stories that were supposed to remain locked inside the walls of their home. Stories about abuse, about violence, about things too heavy to repeat. Betty's chest burned with fury. It wasn't just betrayal, it was exposure. Everything she had worked to keep hidden, everything she had sacrificed to protect, was now in danger of being paraded before the world. She thought of the cameras, the questions, the mocking stares. She thought of the children, their faces turned into objects of curiosity, their lives dissected by people who knew nothing of their pain. She thought of the shame, the ridicule, the way outsiders would twist their suffering into entertainment. BJ wasn't just destroying them from within. She was opening the door to destruction from without. Betty knew then that the collapse was no longer a possibility, it was a certainty. The only question left was how and when. The family gathered that evening, the tension thick as storm clouds. Lorene's voice cracked as she spoke of the whispers in town. Timmy clung to Betty's arm, his eyes wide with fear. Even the younger ones seemed to sense the weight of the moment, their usual chatter replaced by uneasy silence. Betty stood at the center, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. She told them the truth that BJ was back, that she was bringing outsiders into their lives, that she was exposing secrets meant to stay hidden. She didn't soften the words. She couldn't afford to. The room erupted with fear and anger. Some wanted to confront BJ directly, to force her to leave. Others argued that it was too late, that the damage was already done. Larry remained silent, his head bowed, his shame written across his face. Betty watched them, her heart breaking. This was what she had feared: division, suspicion, collapse. And yet she knew there was no turning back. The secrets had been unleashed, and nothing could contain them now. That night, as she lay awake listening to the restless shifting of her family, Betty made a decision. She would face BJ herself. She would confront the source of the chaos, the woman who had dragged their family to the brink time and time again. She didn't know what the outcome would be, but she knew one thing for certain. If the family was to collapse, it would not be in silence. It would be with the truth laid bare, no matter how much it burned. And Betty Whittaker would be the one to carry it into the light. The night Betty chose to face BJ was heavy with silence. The kind of silence that pressed down on the house until every breath felt stolen. She had waited too long, carried too much. The family was fracturing, the secrets spilling faster than she could contain them. And now, with the children restless, with Lorene trembling, with Timmy's eyes wide and afraid, Betty knew there was no more time to wait. She stepped outside, the air sharp against her skin. The path to the camper was short, but every step felt like walking into the past. Every memory of BJ's chaos came flooding back: the screams, the tears, the humiliation, the endless weight of betrayal. And with each step, Betty felt her resolve harden. The camper door was closed, its small window glowing faintly. She could hear voices inside. Larry's low, desperate murmur. BJ's sharper, mocking laugh. The sound sent a chill down Betty's spine, but she didn't falter. She raised her hand and knocked. The laughter stopped. Silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Then the door creaked open, and there she was, BJ. Her face was thinner than Betty remembered, her eyes sharp, calculating. She smiled, but it wasn't warmth, it was victory. "Well," BJ said softly, "look who finally decided to join us." Betty's voice was steady, though her heart thundered. "You don't belong here, not now." "Not ever again?" BJ leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "Funny, Larry seems to think otherwise." Betty's gaze flicked to Larry, who stood behind BJ, his face pale, his eyes refusing to meet hers. Betrayal stung sharper than ever, but Betty didn't let it break her. "You've been telling stories," Betty said, to outsiders, about us. About this family. BJ's smile widened. Truth, Betty, not stories. Truth that's been rotting in this house for decades. People deserve to know. People? Betty's voice rose. You mean strangers. Outsiders who will take our pain and turn it into entertainment. Who will laugh, point, and judge. You don't care about truth, you care about chaos. BJ shrugged, unfazed. Maybe chaos is what this family needs. You've kept everything buried so long, you can't tell lies from reality anymore. At least I'm not afraid to speak. Betty stepped closer, her voice low but fierce. You don't speak truth, you speak poison. And every time you come back, you leave us bleeding. Larry shifted, finally looking at Betty. His eyes were filled with conflict, shame, fear, loyalty twisted in ways Betty couldn't untangle. Larry, she said, her voice breaking, you have to choose. Her or us? If you let her stay, if you let her keep tearing at this family, there'll be nothing left to save. The silence that followed was unbearable. BJ's smirk, Larry's trembling hands, the weight of generations pressing down on them all. Finally, Larry whispered, I can't turn her away. The words shattered what little hope Betty had left. She felt the collapse in her bones, the house crumbling in ways that had nothing to do with wood or nails. BJ's eyes glinted with triumph. See? You don't own him, Betty. You never did. But Betty wasn't finished. She turned to BJ fully, her voice rising with decades of suppressed anger. You think you've won because you dragged him into your chaos. But you've lost. You've always lost. Because all you'll ever be is a shadow that feeds on pain. You can't build. You can't heal. All you can do is destroy. And I won't let you take the rest of us with you. BJ's smile faltered, just for a moment. A flicker of something doubt, maybe fear crossed her face. Betty pressed on. You want to tell outsiders our secrets? Go ahead, let them see. Let them point and laugh. We've lived through worse, but you will not stay here. You will not poison this family any longer. The words hung in the night like a verdict. For the first time, BJ didn't laugh. Her expression hardened, but her silence spoke louder than words. She turned back into the camper, muttering under her breath, and the door slammed shut. Larry stood frozen, torn between the two worlds pulling at him. But Betty knew the choice had already been made. She turned away, her heart heavy but resolute. The collapse had come not with fire or fury, but with silence. The silence of a brother lost to secrets, of a family split by betrayal, of a truth too heavy to contain. Back in the house, the family waited. Their faces told the story, fear, sorrow, uncertainty. Betty met their eyes, her voice steady, despite the ache in her chest. She's gone, she said softly. Maybe not for good, but gone for now. And if she comes back, we'll be ready, Lorene asked the question no one wanted to voice. What about Larry? Betty hesitated, the silence stretching. Finally, she whispered, he's made his choice. All we can do is protect ourselves. The room was heavy with grief. The collapse had come, just as Betty had feared. But in that collapse, something else stirred a fragile resolve. They would endure, as they always had. They would carry the scars, the shame, the weight of secrets. But they would also carry the memory of survival. Because in the end, survival was all they had ever known. And Betty Whittaker, weary and worn, stood as both witness and protector. She had faced the secrets. She had confronted the storm. And though the family stood fractured, she remained unbroken. The story of the Whittakers would continue scarred, whispered, ridiculed, but it would continue. And as long as it did, Betty's voice, steady and unyielding, would remind them of the truth. Secrets can destroy. Silence can suffocate, but even in collapse, survival endures. And that was the legacy Betty Whittaker carried, whether she wanted it or not. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.